Welcome your moderator of the GLOBSEC chat, Tom Nuttall.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Nuttall. I write about European politics and economics for The Economist. We're here for what's going to be a fairly brief session on Brexit. For those watching from afar, it can seem like this campaign has been going on for weeks or months. In fact, it actually formally started only yesterday. We can now look forward to 10 weeks of what will no doubt be a highly civilized debate, grounded entirely in facts, and utterly free of distortions, exaggerations, and posturing. With me to discuss this is David Lidington, who is the British Europe Minister. Please give him a warm welcome. Thank you. Before I start, I will just quickly note that the Minister has been in post since the Conservative Party took office in 2010, which makes him the longest-serving Europe Minister since the post was created in the 1970s. And that's not a bad achievement when you look at under the Labour government, ministers barely had a chance to get their feet under the desk before they were whisked away for a replacement. We have only 30 minutes, so we'll get right into it. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, then we'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A. Because we only have half an hour, I'm going to take a fanatical approach towards timekeeping, both with the Minister and with you lot, because our time is so short. Minister, if I can start by asking, the polls recently seem to have shown a decisive shift towards the Leave position. It's now getting rather close. What, in your view, has gone wrong, and what is the government going to do to turn this around?
I think it was always likely that the polls were going to be close as people focused on the issue. And we've seen, I think, since the migration crisis broke last summer, a shift of a greater number of people moving towards Leave. It's still the case that the majority of polls and the bookmakers all point to a Remain win, but it's not something we can take for granted in any way. And I think that the message that the Prime Minister is very determined to keep pushing forward is that it is to both the economic and security advantage of the United Kingdom to remain an EU member, and there are profound risks about the kind of leap into the dark that leaving would involve.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned the migration crisis. Those of us who have been watching it are acutely aware that it's very much not over yet. The next couple of months, during which the campaign will really gather speed in Britain, could see all sorts of unexpected events there. How worried are you about the ways in which that could feed into the debate over Britain's position in the European Union?
Oh, there's no doubt. I mean, immigration, in its broadest sense, has been the top-ranked issue in terms of British public opinion for well over a year now, ahead of the economy, ahead of the health service, of any of the normal bread-and-butter domestic issues. Now, of course, the UK leaving the European Union is not going to make one iota of difference to what is happening in the Aegean or to the numbers of people in Calais. If anything, it will make it worse because it will make it more difficult for European countries, none of which can solve this crisis on its own, to come together with a cooperative answer. And I think what is really important as we look forward to the next few months, both for the British question, but leaving aside the British question, it's objectively important, is that the EU agreement with Turkey is made to work, that it is implemented properly, and that we press ahead with what we're doing to follow up the Valletta Summit, Khartoum process, working with African countries to try to bring some order to the situation in the central Mediterranean as well.
If Britain does vote to stay in the European Union, it will remain outside perhaps the two most crucial, important areas of cooperation and integration, the first being the single currency, and the second being the sort of asylum and border area of cooperation on which Britain has an opt-out. Now, the government calls this having the best of both worlds. But is there a sense that as the years go by and integration proceeds in these areas in which Britain stays outside, that Britain might anyway drift towards some sort of associate membership of the EU? Can Britain ever be truly happy inside the European Union?
Yes, I think Britain can be happy inside the European Union on the basis of mutual respect on our part for the fact that for some other countries there is a genuine, deep-felt wish to pursue greater fiscal, economic and political integration, and the single currency undoubtedly creates a dynamic that takes things in that direction amongst those countries that are part of it. But equally, which respects the position of member states like ourselves who do not want to pursue that course. And I think that the historic importance of the February European Council agreement was that for the first time it committed the European Union, every member state, publicly, to the notion that there should be more than one destination. We're not talking about two speeds, we're talking about a pattern of variable geometry, differentiated integration, with some countries choosing to pursue a much closer political integration and others not, and each agreeing to respect the other's position.
Okay. We'll now turn it over to the Q&A part of the session. We can take questions from the audience, of course, but also via the GLOBSEC app. The questions will pop up on my gadget here. You can just tap the post a question segment of the app if you have anything that you would like to pose to the Minister. And please let me remind you to be extremely brief because we only have about 20 minutes. I don't want to keep you from your lunch. So, who would like to begin? Please, sir, in the front. And if you could wait for the mic, which I think should be on its way, and please remember to identify yourself with the question.
Thank you very much. My name is Igor Kosir. I'm professor at the Faculty of Political Science and International Relations, MBU, in Banská Bystrica, Slovakia. I would like to raise this very simple question, please. David Cameron quite strongly is supporting this staying in the European Union. But many British businesses, representatives of professional organizations, including politicians, underline that it is not needed, that some strong European vision of Great Britain, presented not only to British citizens, but other 27 European countries, is needed. What do you think about it?
Well, what's clear is that all the main business groups, Confederation of British Industry, Engineering Employers Federation, British Chambers of Commerce, Federation of Small Businesses, either have a corporate position or reflect the views of a majority of their member companies in being decisively in favour of continuing membership of the European Union. I think that the economic case for membership is the one that cuts through most to British voters. That's what every single opinion poll tells us. I mean, the other arguments about security, about diplomatic weight, are important, and we mustn't neglect those, but it is the economic arguments which the evidence suggests matter most to the people casting their vote. And I think we've got to have a combination of arguments. We've both got to emphasise the positive advantages of EU membership. The fact that it has brought a flood of foreign direct investment into the United Kingdom is still the biggest share of any member state of the EU. That it has simplified matters for so many of our businesses, that it has brought benefits to consumers in the forms of cheaper prices and on key opportunities like cheap air travel and cheaper mobile and data charges. So that's important, and we need to continue to demonstrate that the EU is up for the task of completing the single market in services, for forging new trade deals and cutting back on unnecessary red tape and regulation. But there's also is important to keep saying to people that there is no easy alternative. You listen to the champions of Brexit and you get confused and contradictory answers as to what a relationship with the EU outside membership would amount to. Some say Norway, well, that means you accept free movement, you accept paying into the budget, you accept all the rules and regulations, though you have no vote on them. Some say a Canada-style free trade agreement. Well, that doesn't touch services, and it's taking a very long time to negotiate and let alone ratify. Some say rely on the WTO. Well, the WTO rules largely don't apply to services. They still lead to some very significant tariffs that would affect, for example, our car exporters and quite a number of our agricultural food exporters. And they don't normally touch services at all. So all of the alternatives seem to me to be fraught with uncertainty and worse than what we get at the moment.
We had a question here in the front, please, sir.
Jonathan Isle, Rusey, London. Minister, I want to take up Tom's initial remarks and sort of develop them further. Let me take you to the 24th of June, and let's assume that the answer is yes for staying in the European Union. Now, apart from applause when you go back to Brussels, what is the British policy? I mean, do we just say, woof, we passed that hurdle, sit down and continue as before? Or is there a reform agenda of the UK for the European Union that could be taken forward the day after?
Oh, very, very, very definitely the latter, Jonathan, because look beyond the UK, look at the challenges facing Europe and the disaffection in so many countries, which is giving rise to support for populist parties of both right and left in many member states. There's an existential economic challenge thrown at us by global competition and digital technology. If Europe can't raise its game on competitiveness and create more jobs, then the next generation won't have the standards of living or the social protection people expect now. And if that happens, the social and political tensions will be profound. So really pushing forward and leading the agenda on completing that single market, especially in services, which is where most of the new jobs will come from, in trade deals, in cutting unnecessary regulation is key. But then there's a political dimension to this as well. We face challenges from global crime and terrorism. That will require more work, which our Home Secretary Theresa May is helping to lead at European level on things like rules on cross-border firearms movements, on better information exchange between police forces across Europe, passenger name records, which I'm glad was approved by the European Parliament this week, but also challenges from a truculent, aggressive Russia that we need to show solidarity in resisting, because that's a threat to the security of so many countries, particularly in Central Europe, and the challenge of state collapse in parts of Africa and the Middle East, which is one of the key drivers of large-scale movements of people. Not the only one, but it's one key element of that. Again, we can't, Germany can't, France can't sort this on its own. Working together, we stand a chance of doing so. I think it's even more important we do that at a time when the political appetite in the United States for such global interventions is diminished compared with what it once was. You see that in the way in which American voters, are resentful of what they see as Europe consuming security overwhelmingly paid for by American taxpayers.
I'm going to take a question from the app in front of me. This is from Francis O'Donnell from the Institute of International and European Affairs. The question is, if, as polls indicate, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales will vote to remain inside the European Union, if because of the English vote, Britain votes to leave, will this essentially be an English vote for independence?
It's the polls are certain at the moment. They're showing Scotland and Northern Ireland very decisively in favour of continued membership. London very decisively in favour of continued membership, and in rest of England and in Wales too, it's a more close battle. I think that while this has to be a decision for the UK as a whole, it's the UK that's the member state and the signatory of the treaties. There would certainly be, at the very least, some political and constitutional turbulence, because the Scottish National Party and the First Minister of Scotland have already said in the event of a vote to leave, they would press for a second referendum on Scottish independence. I think Northern Ireland, the risks are even more troubling, because this is the UK's only land border. And we've had a common travel area with the Republic of Ireland ever since the partition of Ireland in the early 1920s. And Irish citizens are able to move freely into the UK and vice versa. Now, if that becomes an EU external border, then there may be obligations on the Republic of Ireland to impose checks there. If, as the champions of leaving the EU argue, the one purpose in leaving is to stop EU movement into the UK, well, then you can't do that without some sort of border checks, including at your sole land frontier. And actually trying to impose those would be a massive practical challenge. But I think then, and I was picking this up when I was in Northern Ireland recently, you start just to make what is still an incomplete peace process that little bit more vulnerable. I think there's no wish to make it more vulnerable, either north or south of the border, but I just think we would be crazy to undermine that process of reconciliation in any way.
Which is, of course, why the Irish government is very keen to ensure that...
Why the Irish government is very keen to do so, and why I think public opinion in Northern Ireland, which historically has not always been sort of strongly in support of EU membership, at the moment seems to be quite decisively in favour of Remain.
We had a question over here, please, sir.
Sławomir Debski, Polish Institute of International Affairs, Warsaw. David, my question is following. But in Poland, we are keeping our fingers crossed for this part of the government you represent, who are in favor of staying in the United Kingdom within the European Union. Poland is preparing itself for hosting next NATO summit. If something goes wrong for this part of the government you represent, what Great Britain is going to say, what message is going to deliver during the summit? Thank you.
Well, I think there will be a determination to continue with the commitments to NATO and to collective defence and security that the Prime Minister has championed. And he and the Foreign Secretary have been very clear in their bilateral conversations with their Polish opposite numbers that is their commitment. I just think that at the moment we have a situation where NATO rightly remains the prime organisation for European collective security, and crucially for keeping the Americans and the Canadians bound in at a time when some of the other side of the Atlantic would like to see those links given less priority. But the EU plays an essential complementary role. If we're talking about Russia, Russia presents not just a conventional military challenge to some parts of Europe, but there are challenges that Europe faces in terms of the use of energy as a weapon for diplomatic influence, in terms of how information is used, in terms of how cyber capability is used. And those are things that it is the EU, and not simply NATO, needs to be equipped to respond to.
Question here in the front, please.
Yes, thank you, Philip Blond from Res Publica in London. Really, my question is a combination of the two earlier questions, and I'm profoundly for remaining in. I want you to succeed. I want the Prime Minister...
I saw your tweet.
Thank you very much. But I fear we're missing a trick. I agree with you that the economic argument is at the top, but what those who want to exit have effectively done is they've neutralised the economic argument. If I was a campaign director for them, I'd have done exactly what they've done. They've confused the argument, they've divided business opinion. And so consequently, in a way, for the vote, the strongest hand we have to play has been relatively neutralised. What I fear that we should add to the offer that isn't in the offer, and I think that both questions from the floor asked, is a strong positive, not a technocratic vision for Britain's role. If you look at the people who are voting against Britain joining, they are nationalist, not in a pejorative sense, they're patriotic, they believe in Britain's greatness. And they think Britain's greatness is secured peculiarly and bizarrely by somehow going off alone in a completely, almost kind of fantastical manner that would somehow be Elizabethan kind of pirates again or something vaguely ridiculous. The point is there's an argument I think you need to make that you're not making, and that is that Europe is the platform and the path to Britain's continuing world influence on the global stage, that Europe is the multiplier platform and Europe is the path to Britain's greatness, not the impediment to it.
Can I ask you to get to that?
Why is this argument not being made?
Well, I was making it at some length, actually, in a speech I gave 2 days ago to an FT sponsor conference in London, and I will certainly be doing more of it. I think you will hear more of that as the campaign proper gets underway. But where I disagree with you, Philip, is in saying that business opinion has been divided, economic arguments been neutralised. I agree with your analysis of the tactics from the other side, but the overwhelming view of business continues to be for Remain. The city, for example, come out very publicly as a corporate body to champion Remain. What you do have, of course, it is true, is that the BBC, with the duty of impartiality, is sort of balancing comments. You have, well, the Lord Mayor of London says this on behalf of the city, and then we find a hedge fund manager somewhere who has a different view, and so that is balance, but actually it's not a representative balance of where opinion lies. And I think my one warning, I don't disagree with the key point you were making, but I would just warn that I don't believe UK public opinion is ever likely to be starry-eyed about the EU. There is not and will not be that visceral attachment to the ideal of European integration that you will have in many other parts of Europe. And that stems largely, in my view, from different historical experiences in the mid-20th century, not just from different geography. Both play their part. And therefore, I think the British reaction will essentially always be pragmatic and self-interested, and the bulk of the argument has to target that reality.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so we're into the quick fire round, quick questions, quick answers. I'm going to ask another one from the app. This is from Jakob Wallenstein from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. This is a comment cleverly disguised as a question. Do you believe that the people of the out camp realise how much Brexit would paralyse the EU, forcing us to focus on ourselves for years in order to organise the disentanglement and making it much harder to tackle issues like the migration crisis? Do you believe that?
There is no unanimity of view in the out camp. I think some of the UKIP people would probably say yes, and that's rather a good thing. And in fairness to Farage, he has said in the past that yes, leaving would mean the UK would probably be a bit poorer, might be less influential in the world, but actually that's a price worth paying for what he sees as the benefits. I think a number of the other champions of leaving have just a belief in fairy tales. There is a blithe assumption that everything could fall into place. Alternative arrangements could be negotiated quickly and smoothly, and I think that is just ignoring reality. And I think that is why, when you press them on what the alternative is that they want, the response is either just to shout Project Fear or to try and focus on something to do with process. It is still never to give any detail or to describe the path and the compromises that would be necessary if they were to seek one of those alternatives.
I wanted to take a question that's towards the back, the gentleman over here. Do you have a mic, or if someone could get one to him? And please be very brief.
Stephen Brockman, SEPS, Brussels. Minister, you have focused primarily on the impact for Britain. As Minister for Europe, can you envisage a scenario of Brexit and describe to us what the impact would be on the European Union?
You've got to, obviously you need to leave it to other governments to speak for themselves, but my view would be it would be destabilising, and destabilising at a time when Europe, as I've said, faces profound economic and political and security challenges. I think that it would certainly remove the biggest champion of open markets and free trade from the table, and I think there'd be a risk, therefore, that Europe would become more protectionist, more risk of protectionist arguments, and that would harm Europe's competitiveness and cost jobs. I think that in terms of maintaining a determined front in the face of Russian aggression, that would be weakened. I think that Europe's foreign policy and security capacity would be weakened because you'd be taking out one of the biggest diplomatic and military players. So I think it would be bad news. How would the 27 respond? It's really for them to say, but I think they would certainly, I'm very clear from conversations I've had, some at least, would then push for a very quick leap towards further integration to try and restore stability. And I think that then runs up against the sort of challenge you have from the Le Pens and the Jobbiks and the Five Star Movements and others who would see that as inimical to healing the breach between the public opinion and what are seen as remote decision takers.
Now, we only have about a minute and a half left, so I'm going to abuse my prerogative as the chair and ask the final question myself. Minister, the Prime Minister has said that he's confident that Britain would be able to flourish if we were outside of the European Union. But of course, that would in large part depend on what sort of deal Britain were able to obtain with the EU in the subsequent negotiations that would take place. Are you confident that that you would have a helpful negotiating partner on the other side of the table if Britain were to leave, and that you would be able to get a good deal on things like access to the single market, trade, and so on?
I think you would seek to do so, but the Prime Minister has never underestimated the difficulties. We export something like 44% of everything we sell abroad to the rest of the EU. The EU 27 collectively export 7 to 8% of what they sell to the UK. So the boot's on the other foot, I think, particularly given the 2-year deadline under Article 50 for the exit negotiations to take place, after which the departing state is automatically out with the rights and obligations that flow from membership. I think that the UK is a big enough player, fifth, fourth biggest economy in the world. Actually, we are, the job creating centre of Europe at the moment. We could cope, but I, like the PM, believe that would be very far from the best alternative. I think would be less prosperous. We'd have less opportunity outside. And I think we would not, to go to Philip Blunt's point, we would not be playing the role we should aspire to in terms of shaping the European and the Western challenge to a period of great global challenge.
On that note, we'll have to wrap it up. I've been asked to remind you that lunch is available outside in the lobby and downstairs. And let me also remind you to be back here for 2:15 when we will have another session, also chaired by me, on the critical issue of the future of Europe. Please join me in thanking Minister of Europe, David Lidington.